Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this seventh webinar of our summer school series. Today, I am joined by Adabela. How are you, Adabela?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Diane?
I am really great. I'm really excited about this series. We've had such great speakers, and I know that you are going to add to that and continue that tradition of good speakers. So thank you so much.
Thank
I'm going to
you.
ask a question of our audience. So for those of you that are listening, would you please type into the question box or the chat box what vacation plans you have for this summer or whether or not you've already done it. And then Annabella, while they're telling us where they are going or plan to go, could you tell us what your plans are?
Sure. For the 4th of July, I will actually be going to North Carolina to see good friends of ours. I'm very excited. We haven't seen the whole family in about 3 years. They moved to Germany when the husband of the family joined the military. And it'll be my first time visiting North Carolina. We all have kids around the same age. It's going to be a blast. I'm excited about it.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, that's awesome. Well, we have a couple people that have said nothing really. They're just going to hang out near the house. We have somebody going to Cabo and a cruise in July. We also have somebody that's going to Alaska cruise next week. I'd like to do that. I don't. I'd be a stowaway on that for sure. That is a great. That's a great cruise. I've done that. Let's see. This other person is saying that they're taking their daughter to UC Irvine. Oh, that's interesting for 3 months. Las Vegas for the 4th of July. And so everybody's doing something kind of fun. Idaho for a wedding, New Orleans. Who
I
doesn't
think New
really love?
Orleans, that should be very
I
fun
love
too.
New Orleans. I am so lucky to have a friend there that can show me all the sights. All right, so before we get started with this webinar, I just want to remind everybody that today this webinar is worth 1 CEU. We will email that to you within an hour. If you have any difficulties with it, please let me know. I can help you up to 30 days. There will be a blue button that says My Certificate. Make sure that you click that so that your certificate will download. And then we do have a handouts for this particular webinar, so please make sure to download that so you have the reference material for in the future. If you have any questions, please put it in the question box, not the chat box, but the question box, and I will get those and read those to Annabella so that we can get some answers for you. And then lastly, there'll be an encore performance of this on the Macro Pro YouTube channel. I did have a phone call today saying, hey, what if I watch all the YouTubes? Can I get a certificate for those? And unfortunately not. There's no way for us to do time and attendance when it's on YouTube, but it does have great information. And if you need a topic, you might check there. All right, that's everything for me. The screen is yours, and I'll see you in about 55 minutes.
All right, sounds good. Thank you so much, Diane. Happy first day of summer, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me on this Friday afternoon. Thank you to MacroPro for having this great series. All right, today we will be talking about the nuances of temporary disability, including how it overlaps with other types of leave. This is a presentation that was inspired by my presentation that I did at CAW and listening to some of the items that applicants' attorneys were particularly focusing on when it came to the value of their cases, a lot of which had to do with temporary disability and average weekly wages. It also has to do with some questions that I get about when an applicant is on potentially multiple types of leave and how that might affect temporary disability. So hopefully you find this enlightening. And if you have any questions, I am looking at the question box. Please throw that in there. I want this to be as interactive as possible here today. Just a little bit about us. I am a partner at RTGR Law. For those of you that don't know me, it's a pleasure to meet you. We are a California-wide workers' compensation defense firm. That is all we do is workers' compensation defense. We're also very big on contributing to education in the community. So if you ever have any cool scenarios or questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. You're welcome to email me directly or contact whichever office is closest to you. All of this information is also available on our website. And I would not be a good attorney if I did not start all of my presentations with a quick disclaimer. I don't want to hear about anybody going to the WCAB and saying, well, Adabela told me during her phenomenal presentation for Macro Pro that this is how average weekly wages are calculated. This is not meant to be specific advice. If you do need a specific advice on an issue, please reach out, but this is all just general information meant for general education. All right. So our first topic will be the issues with indemnity. Start at the beginning of the claim. Um, this is something I think gets overlooked a lot. And so I'm just going to briefly touch on this because this is a rather large presentation. But as Diane mentioned, all of this is available to you on the handout. And the first thing is with your connections, whether you are an employer or you're an adjuster, making sure that that communication is there for your employers, that the DWC1 claim form needs to be provided. Even if there's an inkling as to the fact that there might be an injury, let's try to get that started. That's the best way that we can get in front of the discovery process and determine whether there's any potential temporary disability issues, and also start our discovery, which we have to do in due diligence about salaries, wage statements, etc., so that we can start calculating that average weekly wage so we can be ready. And again, so we have to, the employer has to direct the employee to an industrial medical clinic. If you receive a claim and you see, and you're not sure whether the applicant was told that, or the injured worker at this point, I guess, was told that they can seek medical treatment for this injury, following up with that, having that in writing is great, because then if we do move forward with denying temporary disability or denying the claim altogether because of lack of medical treatment, you can say, hey, we tried to do what we could to get this evidence. The applicant is well aware of their rights, and so that's a better defense. You do have the right to delay a claim, and I definitely recommend doing so if there are issues with obtaining information such as medical treatment records or work statuses. Um, but the delay does have to be in good faith, and it does activate our need for due diligence in that discovery. Most of claim denials that I see has a form that says, please provide this medical information, your medical history, where you're treating, etc. That's great. Always love to see follow-up letters as well, or follow-up emails. Um, do note that during the delay period, you do have to provide up to $10,000 of medical care. But during this time, the employee is not entitled to temporary disability during the delay period. So please note that. It might pop in after, and if there are current work statuses, you do want to check for any EDD payments before you start issuing TD, or at least only start based on the fact after that period, so that if EDD was paying, you're not able to get a hold of them, there's at least no double recovery for the injured worker at that point. Um, you could just make sure that, let's say during that delay period, EDD issues 2 weeks um, of payments, right? You would just make sure that you don't issue more than 102 weeks of TTD so that you can reimburse EDD later without going over that 104-week max. And just keep the applicant or the injured worker notified as to why you're issuing certain payments, why there's a certain due date. For example, it would be if you're picking up temporary disability, now that it's accepted, you would say we are picking up temporary disability as to the accepted date. We are not picking up for the period of delay because, one, you weren't entitled to it at that time as it was in delay, or two, we are trying to figure out whether EDD issued any payments. All right, temporary disability in general. Temporary disability is meant to be wage replacement. And I think that this is something that, although very basic, is something that we forget. If the applicant is still working either with the employer or with someone else and there are no lost wages, then there is an argument that they are not entitled to temporary disability. Temporary disability should continue if the applicant is not able to earn wages because of the accepted body parts and injury until they are permanent and stationary. That really should be the end date. In a situation where the applicant has not returned back to work, The way that a benefit printout should look is 2 years of temporary disability up until the day that the 104 weeks has been exhausted, and then PDAs should start up to a reasonable amount based on the medical record. You do have two different types of temporary disability benefits. Temporary total disability, which means that the injured worker is not able to return back to work at all. In other words, they're not receiving any wages for that period. And temporary partial disability. This would be that maybe they're limited in the amount of hours that they can work, or they have certain physical restrictions that leads to modified duty that makes them earning less than they would normally. And we'll go into some examples a little bit later in this presentation, so don't worry. But a quick example of that would be now they're limited to working 4 hours or maybe even 8 hours, but they used to be able to work overtime. Now they can't work overtime and they would regularly work that overtime. That would be a reason for wage loss or temporary partial disability. So in summary, when is temporary disability due? What are those red flags that you want to know and make sure that your claim is that on your claim you are issuing temporary disability? When the claim is accepted, not during the delay period. So if you're on your delay period, don't worry about that temporary disability. When the medical evidence supports the injured worker has been off work. I hate to see a benefit printout that shows that an applicant has been receiving temporary disability, but I don't have any medical reports or medical certifications in the file. If you're not receiving medical certifications, if you're not receiving medical reports, or maybe you're just getting physical therapy reports but no work statuses, that is a reason to issue a notice of temporary disability termination. Obviously, give them a reasonable amount of time. I would say 30 days, especially if they're represented, to remedy this issue, to provide you with that report. But don't be worried to send those notices saying temporary disability is going to be terminated because you are not giving me a PTP report, or the PTP is not in the MPN, or what have you. Again, as long as you are documenting those issues, temporary disability should not be issued if you're not receiving those work statuses. Retroactively, they might be due when the claim was originally denied and then later accepted. There's TD exposure there. Before you issue anything retroactively, please, please, please check with EDD first. And EDD can only pay a max of a year. So if you're around that point, know to document your file for only paying 52 weeks of temporary disability after that acceptance. I say that because unfortunately, sometimes EDD reps can be very difficult to reach. That alone is not enough to just continue delaying TTD, but you know that the max that they could have issued was 52 weeks. This works better in a represented case because that will shift the burden over to applicant's attorney. If you can show, hey, we've tried to get EDD's information and it has not been provided yet, they need to get you that information. It's a two-way street there. If they're unrepresented, that gets a little bit trickier. But again, you want to show that you've made those efforts, but you also want to avoid double payment. Retroactively is also popular when the PQME or the NAME report down the line all of a sudden supports it. Maybe the applicant wasn't receiving treatment for whatever reason, but now the PQME says, well, according to them, they were just home. There's no evidence that they weren't just home and that they were home because of their injury. So now, since the injury, I'm finding TTD. You can dispute that for not substantial medical evidence potentially, but know that that does warrant a retroactive temporary disability period. And so if you're disputing that, you need to issue an objection. You need to send a TD notice explaining this is why we aren't paying you despite this report. And just a note, we'll go more into public safety officers. Well, I guess first, do we have anybody on that does safety officers? Because if not, I can just switch over that 4850 information. Please write down in the chat if you do 4850 so that I know as we go into more detail there. But just as a general, public safety workers are entitled to 1 full year of salary per Labor Code 4850. So when is the temporary disability not due? Claim is denied. There's no medical certifications. 104 weeks have already been paid. There's been 5 years since the date of injury has passed. This is one that is strangely enough coming up again. Some applicants' attorneys are picking up older claims and making some assertions of what may be due now that the applicant had surgery later on and for whatever reason the claim never resolved. Please note that after that 5 years, they don't get temporary disability. All right, great. I am seeing that we have 4850, so I will cover that in a little bit more detail later. Thank you for letting me know. When the applicant's working full duty, obviously they're not going to be entitled to temporary disability. And when the applicant has reached permanent and stationary status. All right, so here's that safety officer 4850 benefits. 4850 provides special disability compensation for police officers, firefighters, sheriffs, inspectors, and district attorney investigators, among others. If you have any questions about who's covered, Labor Code 4850 will tell you. And it does provide up to 1 year of salary continuation in lieu of temporary disability benefits. Some things about that, because they are entitled to that, you will have some applicants' attorneys who will want a 4850 buyout before proceeding to early settlement. Um, it's something that would seem unconventional because obviously you don't buy out someone's temporary disability benefits, but it is commonly done in order to settle cases in an expedited manner before a full MMI report in safety officers. This happens because a lot of the times a safety officer is nearing retirement and they might file now everything on their body, right? So maybe their orthopedic injury from 2 years ago is now permanent and stationary, but their heart is still at issue. This last CT that they just filed is at issue. So that buyout does happen. So for anybody that might be new to 4850, that might sound kind of crazy, but it is considered to be a benefit that they have earned, and so it is commonly bought out. This kind of just goes into who's eligible for 4850. Again, this is a handout that will be provided to you, so you can just check base with that. The one thing is a person must be employed on a regular or full-time basis. So this does exclude reserve police officers, sheriff's reserves, volunteers, and volunteer firefighters. The benefits are full salary, tax-free. You can see why someone would be motivated if they want to settle early to make sure that they are getting the full totality of that benefit. But it probably excludes overtime and uniform pay, or probably, yeah, and probably excludes holiday pay. There's case law to support that. There's no statutory entitlement to 4850 for attendance at medical appointments when the injured worker is working full time. So if they're back to work full time, but they have to go get a CT or something, they're not necessarily entitled to a full day's pay for that. But before you do any decisions as to 4850, where you really want to look at is your contract with the union to determine what is covered. Every employer will have their own MOU agreement with their union, and that will ultimately be the decision as to what's covered and what isn't. The leave of absence is a foundational prerequisite to a 4850's loss of salary guarantee. So even if an injured worker, safety officer, is returned back to, let's say, modified duty, you're not going to calculate wage loss off of their full salary. You're going to calculate wage loss as if it was wage loss with regular TTD. It does not include regular step or pay increases for anticipated promotions unless the injured worker can demonstrate a binding past practice that would automatically grant such increases. Where would you find this? Most likely in your MOU. It would state what's regular. If the department has annual increases of a certain amount, that could classify as proof, but it does shift the burden to them. And what this is trying to say is essentially don't overpay someone. Sometimes the burden needs to be on the injured worker, particularly if they're already represented. If they're unrepresented, it might not be worth the fight, depends on how much money we're talking about. But if they're represented, that's a battle that they can fight if they think that they can meet that burden. Each separate industrial injury can result in a full year of 4850 benefits. And so even though they can't run concurrently, this is why, again, at the end of a safety officer's career, they might be looking for a buyout because depending on how many injuries they had and how much labor, how much 4850 they might be accrued or be able to accrue in the timeline, that might be something that they want to buy out. 4850s is subject to the cap of temporary disability. So the Court of Appeal held that the 104-week cap on temporary disability is also applicable to 4850, and that's the middle case. So they're entitled to up to 1 year of Labor Code 4850 and 1 year of temporary disability. And all 4850 and TD will end after 5 years of the date of injury. So if this injured worker now is retiring at the end of their career, but the last case that they had that they might have some extra 4850 left over was over 5 years ago, they don't get that. So the termination of 4850 benefits will happen after you reach 52 weeks of Labor Code 4850 being paid, or until the date that the injured worker is retired on a permanent disability pension and is actively receiving permanent disability pension payments, or ADDP or ADPP. As soon as temporary disability starts after 4850 ends, that's when FMLA or CFRA will start. So that's just a note in terms, and we'll go more into that overlap later, but just so you know, it does not, 4850 does not overlap with FMLA or CFRA, but temporary disability does. And I just received a question. If the claim was placed on delay and we have to accept the claim pursuant to QME opinions, in reference to the 104-week limit, does TD start from the beginning of disability date or from the payment issued date? That's a great question. So the 104-week limit is from the what payments have been issued. But they should be issued, if I'm understanding your question correctly, that should issue based on when the first disability date is. But let's say for whatever reason, you've already paid. I'm trying to think of a situation where it might happen. Do you have a specific example that you're thinking of by any chance so that I can apply that? I'll see if you can give me a specific example. But yeah, so the 104 weeks is what's actually paid. So if for whatever reason you pay 104 weeks of temporary disability payments, whether that's Labor Code 4850, TD, or both, um, and somehow that timeline gets shifted either sooner or later because of a QME opinion or another doctor's opinion. If those 104 weeks are paid, you owe no more. EDD could possibly pick up if you're over 104 weeks. Um, Maybe they already got EDD before you started issuing, and you would just tell them, "Hey, I've already paid my 104 weeks, so I don't owe you anything." EDD. The 104 weeks is a solid argument that no additional temporary disability is owed. So no matter when you started payment, if you've exhausted those 104 weeks, you're done paying. Hopefully that answers your question. If not, please send me an email to make sure that I understand what you're asking and I can give you an answer to that. All right, so termination of 4850. So 4850 benefits will actually continue even if the applicant becomes permanent and stationary, so long as they remain off work because of their injury and they are not retired. So again, this is kind of why applicants' attorneys are seeking for that 4850 buyout, because it's an absolute right or benefit, I guess, that safety officers would have. There is legal support for termination of 4850 following a voluntary or involuntary resignation, um, and after service-connected retirement, because a leave of absence, that's no longer a leave of absence. And it does need to be a leave of absence in order for them to receive 4850 benefits. So if they voluntarily resign, if they get terminated for cause, anything like that, that is an argument that they are no longer on a leave of absence, and so they are no longer entitled to 4850. All right, so we talked about 4850 for all those people that weren't safety officers. If you have more follow-up questions on that, there's a whole presentation that I do just on 4850 and safety officers. So please don't hesitate to reach out with me for questions. But now for those that haven't done safety officers or don't do safety officers currently, uh, time to check back in because now we're going to cover how it affects other types of leave. So what are some of the types of leave that might interact with the workers' compensation process that might leave you asking, do we owe temporary disability? Do we not? Or are those other types of leaves of absences still ongoing, or do they get added to that time where they're protected to be off work for workers' compensation? First, we have the Americans with Disability Act, the the ADA, which is a federal statute. And this isn't a statute that will apply to payment during leave. This is just a statute that protects the right to a reasonable accommodation. It actually doesn't mandate a specific amount of time for leave, so nobody is limited to return in a certain period, unlike temporary disability that you have 104 weeks. The ADA has different requirements for that. It does require the interactive process, which temporary disability, once you receive a work status that has some restrictions, there should also be the interactive process there. So that's where the big overlap is between these two statutes. Similarly, the Fair Employment and Housing Act, the FEHA, which is also a federal statute, very similar, right to a reasonable accommodation. It actually provides the statutory language for how to conduct the interactive process. It also doesn't mandate a specific amount of time. But what's important with this is that both of these types of leave will run concurrently with temporary disability. So someone could be on ADA or could be on FEHA for being off work and then also be receiving temporary disability for their workplace accident. And also the other way that it intersects is for modified duty before you can deny temporary disability if someone's been given restrictions. So technically in a report, they are temporarily partially disabled because they could return back to work under some restrictions. You need to show that there was some sort of interactive process by the employer to try to accommodate those restrictions. If the employer is no longer around, if you have poor communication with the employer, or if the employer does not do the interactive process, the injured worker might have a different cause of action against the employer for the lack of the interactive process. But in terms of what do you do with TTD, you're going to have to pay it. We have to be able to show that they made a good faith effort to accommodate, that a job offer was made. If in writing, the better, because getting people to the board, especially now that we're in person, to testify that an offer was done is not usually that great, along with the technicality difficulties of getting people to the board. It's also then becomes a he said, she said situation. In writing is best. If you as a claims examiner, you're looking at your file and you're not seeing that type of interaction, just know that you're likely going to have to pick up TTD. We got one more. Can we terminate TD when an injured worker retired while he or she is on TTD? Does it matter whether it is a disability or service retirement? It does, and we're actually going to get to that here shortly. So hold on that. We will get to that. All right, some other types of leaves that you're going to see interact. We have the Family Medical Leave Act, which is federal. Here we're going to start seeing that these have certain timelines, which is important. FMLA, federal statute, applies to employers with 50 or more employees, and it provides up to 12 weeks of unpaid protected leave. This runs concurrently to temporary disability. So for all of you claims examiners or account managers or even maybe employer reps that are out there right now listening, you can start that 12-week period to start running when the person is on TTD. It's the same for the California Family Rights Act. The big difference between FMLA and the CRFA is who it applies to. California expanded it to apply to many more employers by lessening the requirement to only 5 employees versus 50. And it also provides up to 12 weeks of job protective unpaid leave within 12-month period for specific family and medical reasons. This will also run concurrently with TTD. Paid sick leave that some employers decide to give to their employees does not run concurrently. And so if you see that an injured worker took some sick days or sick leave and you think it might be related to the TTD or to the injury that you're trying to decide whether or not to issue TTD, that's something that you should probably investigate, because the injured worker or their attorney will probably argue that some of that sick leave should be returned back to the injured worker, and it should instead be covered retroactively by temporary disability payments. So just keep that in mind. And as I've been alluding to throughout this presentation, and I cannot hammer home enough, notices are important to defending choices regarding indemnity. Unless you are sending out notices that are unprofessional, like calling people dumb or idiotic or lazy, which I don't expect from any of you, but you'd be surprised what I've seen in the past, you cannot have enough written communication to an injured worker. Always make sure to include the applicant's attorney if they are represented, but as many notices as you need to keep track of what's going on in the claim and why decisions are being made is crucial to defending us if should the applicant become represented or should issues of penalty go up to the board. And that's why, I mean, I shouldn't say that's why. Applicants' attorneys are just trying to get their clients the benefits that they need and are entitled to. However, there is the added incentive for them to argue these at the board, because not only can they receive fees from these arguments, but they can also file for penalties, which leads to additional fees for them and also additional money to their client. So we want to be able to avoid that as much as possible. And most applicants' attorneys, if they bring up an argument that something was not issued correctly, if we're able to show them the documentation of our thought process, they'll likely back off. If not, maybe from the expedited hearing, they might at least back up from any assertions for penalties. And remember, at the board, an injured worker will always receive the benefit of the doubt. And so we don't want to have to be up against no written communication and the applicant saying that they have suffered extreme financial loss because of a decision that may or may not have been supported. Adjusters also switch files a lot, as we know. And so you want to make sure you want to ideally inherit a file where you can say, okay, this is why TTD was denied at this point, and you would like to be able to hand off a file that also says the same later on. Of course, the first two notices that I look for, an acceptance and denial notice. And sometimes I see that there's a denial notice and then later the claim was accepted, and for whatever reason, the acceptance letter never went out. Or it's a general acceptance letter and it doesn't specify which body parts. Even if at the time of injury or at the time that you're accepting the claim, you are accepting all the body parts alleged for that injury, the body parts may change later on. Body parts will likely get added if this becomes litigated. And so you want to make clear that what you are accepting. We are accepting this claim date of injury blank for these body parts. So that then if it gets represented and on the application you receive 10 more body parts on there, it's clear that those 10 body parts were not accepted. I like to go a step further than two. Once that we get an amended application or a new application, send out a new notice saying these body parts accepted, these new body parts are denied, and here's why. Again, we cannot emphasize enough. And then that way, how does that relate to TTD? Well, if all of a sudden only the neck and the back were accepted originally, and now the applicant is off work because of their left knee, we can say we're denying TTD because that is not an accepted body part. And then EDD can go ahead and pay if they find the medical certification sufficient or not, but at least we're protecting our interest and we're not all of a sudden accepting a body part that we didn't mean to accept just because we didn't explicitly exclude them. Notice of starting temporary disability. This is absolutely required by the statutes for the first time that the applicant is being paid temporary disability. However, we always recommend that one gets sent out whenever there is a change in temporary disability status. For example, you know that modified work was offered, um, and they denied it or they rejected that claim. You want to send out a notice saying, hey, we're denying it because here's your work offer, and you said no. If they were released back to work, you want to include that in that notice. You should also include notices of change of benefit rate. Should the applicant be entitled to a pay raise or rate was being paid too high for whatever reason, you'd want to also include in that notice that we will be asserting a credit later on. If it gets changed from temporary disability to permanent disability, or if they all of a sudden refer to modified duty, so now you're paying wage loss. And I did receive some questions here. Um, Sending the amended denial of additional body parts and allegations, is it required? No, it's not required, but if so, then you run into a couple of issues. If you're not clarifying that additional body parts are denied either through an answer to the amended application or through a denial notice, arguably you could be waiving the right to deny that because, for decisions, you have 90 days. Um, if it was delayed. And so the best practice is to make sure that it's clear somehow that additional body parts are denied. The other reason for this too is not just to note your files so that if RFAs come in for those body parts, it's clear for whoever gets that RFA, if you happen to be on vacation or what have you, that those RFAs shouldn't even go to UR. It is for a body part that is not accepted. Because then if you send it to UR and UR for whatever reason authorizes it, there's no way of going back. And if you start authorizing treatment for a body part that's denied, you have now implicitly accepted that body part. A way that this comes up is all of a sudden someone starts getting blood pressure medication, let's say. And maybe you do need it because of this orthopedic injury. Maybe they can't get injections until their blood pressure is controlled. So there might be a reason for accepting that, and that's okay. But let's say it just kind of slips through the cracks. Now, if the applicant is asserting a circulatory issue and you've been issuing their medication, you can't just stop that medication for a couple of reasons. One, there's the argument that you've implicitly accepted it. Two, if you do end that medication and now all of a sudden they have a heart attack, there is a good argument that that heart attack is now industrial and potentially a new injury. So that's why it's important to make sure that as many notifications in the file note what's accepted, what's denied, and why. Um, I remember there was a case where a carrier was authorized to pay after authorizing for years. Yes, you're right. So that is based off of case law that says that once you start accepting something, you can't all of a sudden stop when you realize that it's denied. You have to just keep paying for it. I have another question. What if they were working modified duty at the employer location, but the employer wants them to go to an alternative location and the injured worker turns it down? Can I deny temporary disability because modified duty is available? Um, That's a great question. And I usually use the logic of when the voucher is owed. So as you know, if you don't want to owe the voucher, you have to make a good faith offer of work that is within certain reasonable terms, geographical location. It has to be for 80% or more of the regular salary that they were having. So if it's a substantial wage decrease, it's not considered the same. If it's too far from a geographical location, it's not considered the same. So even though there's not like a strict amount that I can tell you, okay, 15 miles is reasonable, because it'll also depend on where they live. If you live somewhere very remote, traveling 50 miles for work might be reasonable. If you live in somewhere more congested, then 50 miles is probably not reasonable to travel for work. So that would really be a factual analysis as to whether the offer of modified work was still reasonable to that employee. Hopefully that makes sense, Candace. If you're telling them, yeah, I have modified work available, but you live in the Bay Area and now it's in Reno, Nevada, probably not. right? But if you say, okay, you live in Antioch, you used to travel to Concord for work, and now we're asking you to go to Walnut Creek, that's probably reasonable, and turning it down you would be able to deny TTD on that basis. And sorry for anybody that's not from the Bay Area. Those were Bay Area cities, but essentially the difference between, okay, now you only have to travel 10 more miles versus 50 more miles, that could be considered reasonable. When in doubt, send a delay. If you're not sure if applicant is back to work because now they're working at a new employer, if you're not sure that they're receiving EDD, if you're trying to evaluate whether a work offer was reasonable when they turned it down, um, just delay it and just give yourself a time period and explain why that you're delaying it and what you're doing to remedy that delay. Maybe you're saying, hey, I've subpoenaed your new employer's records to see if you are currently working, and if so, how much you're making. They have not provided that to me. Please provide it so that I don't have to deny your temporary disability or your wage loss. That works. Um, Again, it's not something that can maybe be a slam dunk in avoiding you having to pay TTD for always, but it will definitely be a defense against any penalties. Um, if temporary disability is being denied, a denial notice, must be sent within 14 days after the determination. Please just timely send those out. If it was due to a medical report, send that medical report. Honestly, that applies to anything. If you're denying it because they were offered back to work and you have that letter, send that. If you're offering because they're currently earning money somewhere else, send that. If you're denying because it's due to a certain body part that's denied, attach the denial, and then also attach the medical report that says that they are receiving or they're off work because of that injury. Um, and you also want to send notice of benefits ending. If you're planning on terminating, a notice of intent to terminate. If they're ending because they're starting permanent disability or they were released back to work, just send that out. And remember that once an applicant is permanent and stationary, temporary disability is not due. This is when an applicant is permanent and stationary on all body parts in one injury. So if the head is still not permanent and stationary, but all the orthopedic parts are, you still do not owe, you still owe temporary disability because if that head is keeping them off work. Now, if there's no restrictions because of that head, they're able to, their headaches are not stopping them from working, it was purely orthopedic, then you can say I'm ending temporary disability because nothing's taking you off work. But it's not because they're permanent and stationary. Permanent and stationary is referring to the full injury. If they have two injuries kind of happening concurrently, a CT and a specific maybe, that gets a little bit more complicated. All right, so now we're going to go with common issues with temporary disability payments. This goes into what I was mentioning that I'm seeing at the board that are issues that applicants' attorneys are bringing up, but are legitimate issues with issuing temporary disability. One, the applicant is not receiving regular or timely care. The applicant returned back to work. We already kind of talked about that. The rate of temporary partial disability and average weekly wages. Seasonal workers, credit for temporary disability overpayments, and then what we were talking about, retirement or termination. What is the name of the case law that allows for an increased temporary disability rate to be paid if wages dropped due to the pandemic? I might actually have that in this presentation. I can't remember off the top of my head, but if not, please send me an email and I will go ahead and send you any case law related to this presentation and including that question. If you could just email me. For those of you that don't know, just real quick, my email address is my first name, Adabela, Adabela, 1L at rtgrlaw.com. If you have any questions, please reach out. All right, so lack of timely care. Sometimes there's delay in medical treatment by nobody's fault. I had some cases where there were changes of physicians and such happening right during that November, December time, doctors aren't necessarily in the office. There could be a delay. Maybe applicants' attorneys are out of the office, etc. Um, we have to use reasonable uh, expectations during situations like that. If there is just a month gap of treatment, that's probably not enough to say that you don't owe temporary disability. Now, if you're trying to get the injured worker to go to the doctor, if you're sending letters, emails, etc., saying, hey, we need a certification, and they're just not going, applicants' attorneys just not referring them to a doctor that's actually issuing reports, then we can shift that burden, but you want to make sure that you're documenting that. But if a delay is happening by no fault of the applicant, including potentially fault of the applicant's attorney, but not the applicant, you're likely going to owe TTD retroactively if you decide to not issue TTD. But what we want to see in that situation is we want to see a notice of intent to terminate temporary disability sent out with the reason why. You have not provided us with, you have not attended the MRI that our vendor has been trying to schedule now for 2 months, and the doctor needs this to make a decision. So we are going to terminate your temporary disability unless you go to that appointment. Um, and then that's also showing that you're continuing temporary disability for a good faith period. You're giving them time to remedy the situation. You're not just terminating it outright. If it's an issue with the doctor not issuing reports, don't be scared to put that in your notice of intent because that also shifts the burden to them to pick another doctor rather than continue working with a doctor that is just not providing what you need. This is also, I don't know if this applies to anybody here. Please let me know if it does. If you don't have an MPN, sometimes individuals will go seek treatment with a doctor who just doesn't know the regulations that they are obligated to do under 98 Labor Code 9875. You might send them a letter telling them what their obligations are, and they still might not listen. In that type of situation where you can't control who they go to, uh, including that in your notice of intent to care, you are going to this primary care provider. They are not providing us with reports pursuant to the labor code that they are entitled to do. And so we are going to have to terminate your benefits unless you go to a doctor that provides it, or you start getting this doctor to provide those type of reports. Return back to work. An employer's liability for temporary disability terminates when an employee is deemed able to return back to work. If they refuse to go back to work, they're not entitled to temporary disability. And we kind of covered this earlier when we got the question on the situation. An employer must make a valid bona fide proposal in order to avoid the liability. It does not have to be for the original employer. They could be returning back to work for a subsequent employer. Maybe they're working with an external company that can provide some type of modified duty, and maybe they hate it, right? Maybe they were doing, they were a custodian, and now they're folding clothes at a donation thrift store that the employer is working with. They don't get to decide whether or not they like it. If it's within their restrictions and they deny it, and again, it's within a certain geographical region, they're still getting paid the same amount. If everything else seems reasonable, you can deny for that reason. If the applicant is not making the same wages, the applicant may be entitled to temporary partial disability or wage loss. And wage loss issues. This I see at the board a lot. There are a lot of issues with calculating wage loss, both sometimes from the claim, but sometimes the applicant's attorney just doesn't know how to calculate it. So again, this will be on the handout. Please look at this when determining how to do wage loss. It's not just what they were making versus what they're earning now, and that's now what they're entitled to. They're actually, you have to do what their wage loss is and then multiply that by 2/3. So you're essentially getting the TD rate of the wage loss. It's harder to say out loud and understand than it is by looking at it. So just make sure that you're doing that right. Let's say that they are now back to work with a subsequent employer and you're trying to calculate wage loss, but they're not providing it to you. That's a reason to do a notice of intent, but please mark your file that should at the end of the claim, the applicant's attorney provide you with that proof, um, although they would not be entitled to interest or penalties as you did not have that information contemporaneously to when it was owed, you would definitely, I guess I shouldn't say definitely, you probably would owe it retroactively as well. So just note your file that exposure is there when you're trying to determine reserves and claim valuations, whether that's you or your attorney, that should be taken into consideration, that this information may be coming in. Should the employer or should the employee be providing that to you at the same time, contemporaneously? Of course that they should. But again, at the board, it will not be held against the applicant. It should be held against the applicant's attorney, but that doesn't always happen. There sometimes are a good faith reason why that isn't happening. Maybe the employer issues payments weird. Maybe, they're only working part-time and so they only get paid at the end of the month. I saw that with someone who was working, used to be a chef, now working at a cafe, at oh my God, I just forgot the word. Catering, there we go. Catering company. And so they were only catering once or twice a month. And so they didn't get their full pay stubs until after a month. And so it just wasn't regularly coming in. But in that type of situation, you would be entitled to assert that they are not entitled to full temporary disability, but instead wage loss. You want to get credit for that type of thing. And then, when you're determining wage loss, you want to be sure that you're starting with the right number. What is average weekly wage? The earnings means it's the employee's gross, not net earnings. And most of the time, the applicant's earnings are calculated by determining the total amount of the applicant earned in the year before an injury divided by 52 weeks. There are some other factors that might come into play, including other valuable benefits, such as lodging, meals, if they get paid for travel. It's a fact-based assessment whether or not that would be included. Some of the things to consider is how regular that added amount was. Was it only occasional? Like, did they regularly work overtime? Did they not? Was it occasional? So there's some wiggle room there. And then obviously always keep into consideration the max and minimums when it comes to issuing TTD. Let's see. I got another question. If an employee has some side job like photography and coaching, are we responsible for the entire loss when employees on TTD? How about if the photography gig is 300 for that day and they are not already a max earner? Obviously, you nailed it, Desi, by saying, if they're a max earner, it's kind of it's a wash. Let's say that they're not. It would depend on how often they're doing it and whether they can show that they are unable to do that because of their work restrictions. If it's something that they would just do, let's say every once in a while with no regularity, it was kind of a hobby that they sometimes got paid for, there's a good argument that that should not be included in average weekly wage calculations. But if regularly they've been working, let's say, 1 gig a month or 1 gig, let's do a better one, 1 gig a week at $300, that probably should be included. You would just kind of want to see the past 52 weeks or however much you have to calculate based on your employer, and then see how regular that other side job was during that same period and make the calculation from there. But it is fact-based, so I can't say for sure one way or the other. So I did get a question from the audience in anticipation of this presentation, and one was, the employee works as a mechanic and gets an hourly rate plus piecework. He is on modified duty, and so he can't do piecework, but he is working his normal hourly. Is he entitled to, would that be included in wage loss? And again, that's going to be the same answer that I just had. It depends on how regular the piecework was. If he was doing piecework once a week, then probably yes. But if he's only done piecework once in the past 6 months, then no. Just depends on how regular it is. The other one that I had was an employee is a music instructor. He gives instruction on the side. He is working modified duty. How do we calculate wage loss? And again, it would be, okay, are you still able to do the side jobs? Let's say he is, but now it's less and they were regular, then yes, you would take that into consideration. And I actually had a case like that where the injured worker was a drummer and a drumming instructor. Essentially, he was able to continue working the entire time. He had no missed time, but he was on restricted hours. And so all we saw was that his work hours with this employer went down, and his work hours doing personal lessons on the side also went down. I will say that because those were personal lessons that the applicant had to keep track of, it was up to the applicant's attorney to provide me with that proof. He had to provide me with proof of the checks that he was receiving and when he worked and how many hours on the side so that I could then complete the math. There was some delay in issuing those TPD payments, the partial payments, the wage loss, because of that added time. And this applicant's attorney was very reasonable and didn't make an issue of it, but should it have been in another situation where either A, they're not providing me timely with that information, or B, now they're getting upset about how long that takes. That's just part of life. That's something that I would not have an issue taking up to the board. As long as we can show that we're trying. Seasonal workers. Do we have anybody on here that does seasonal workers? Um, in in short, until I know for sure, calculating a seasonal workers. Yes, we do have some. Okay, great. So seasonal workers, it depends on how they're paid and what's the situation. So you have different type of seasonal workers, right? You have some that work on contract. For example, a teacher might only be a 9 month employee, a custodian maybe only a 9 month employee, etc., versus a full 12 months. In that situation, you could consider, okay, they would not be working during the summer, and so that should not be included. You should only include TTD based on those 9 months, and then while they're off work, they should not. But let's say the teacher then says, yes, but during the summer, I normally work as a camp counselor to make up for the 3 months that I'm not paid. And they're able to show that they've done this in the past pretty regularly and how much they were paid. Even though they're your seasonal worker, you will probably have to issue 12 months of TTD because they're able to show that they would have been working but for your injury. This gets a little bit more complicated when we're dealing with laborers who might not have a guarantee. Um, Another really interesting example that's actually the case law is that there was a veterinary assistant who was going to college, and she ended up having a pretty severe hand injury that made it so that she could not actually finalize her career as a vet tech. And so her earning capacity was substantially decreased, and the applicant's attorney argued that that should be her TD rate should be what she could have earned after her certification program had ended, not the minimum that she was making as just a vet assistant. At that point, it was actually the court agreed with the defendant, but nowadays we believe that that would not be the case. And I actually presented this at call with a judge, and we kind of walked this through. And the reason why is nowadays you really can determine whether or not someone was serious about finalizing their future career. You can see how far they were in the program. Were they doing well, or were they missing every class? So it again, it just comes down to it's going to be a factual issue as to whether or not the TD rate should be just for the period that they were seasonally working for you, or whether it's going to encompass some sort of external source of income. I really simplified that down. If you have questions about seasonal workers, I encourage you to look at the handout. And then if you have any other questions, please let me know. We're down to almost a minute, so that's why I'm trying to move through this. Retirement and termination. There's a lot of case law on this issue, but in short, for retirement, to determine whether an employee is entitled to temporary disability following retirement, the employer must assess, one, whether the employee is retired from all purposes or only from the particular employment. So are they able to work somewhere else? Like they can't be a safety officer anymore, but they're still able to work somewhere else. Very different from someone who now is 100% disabled and has to retire from the workforce. Um, and whether the decision to retire was related to the industrial injury. If it was related to the industrial injury, you might still owe TTD. If it was just, hey, I've done my time, I'm 70 years old, I'm just done working, then you have an argument against TTD. The burden is on the defendant to show that when the applicant left the employer, the employee truly did it voluntarily or whether it was due to their injury. All right, I have 26 seconds left. Okay, I can take a few more minutes. So how about now I take some questions. Um, Yes. So Stacy mentioned that teachers may still get paid for the year, even though they only work 9 months. Yes, depending on the agreement with the union, sometimes they're able to spread out their payments throughout the year, even though they work 9 months. In that case, obviously TTD would be available potentially for the whole time because they would be receiving that payment throughout the summer as well. If it's automatic, that might get a little bit tricky. I would ask in that situation to see the MOU and see how it deals with leave of absences during the summer, whether they're just automatically entitled to that or whether if they take a leave of absence during that year, it affects their ability to collect in the summer. That's a pretty employer specific question depending on what the contract says. Um, I did see someone, if I could provide my email again, it is my first name, A, D as in dog, A, B as in boy, ELA, at rtgrlaw.com. So if you do have any specific questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. And again, for seasonal workers, if you have laborers, that can get pretty complex depending on the situation. And obviously, they're not the most sophisticated employees most of the time, and the board will take that into consideration. So in terms of, oh, they don't have, proof of wage statements, et cetera, we know that some of them are paid under the table, and that is not going to be held against the employee. So just keep that all in mind when you're determining whether it's a slam dunk in TTD rate or how far you have to pay for it or not. If the evidence isn't available to those type of employees, it's not going to be held against them.
Let me ask a question. How can you validate the amount of money that they're getting paid under the table?
A lot of the times we ask for bank statements, and most of the time they are willing to provide it. If, let's say, someone does not have a bank statement for a particular reason and they are willing to testify to it, a lot of the times that's a kind of case that would go in front of the board and the judge would decide whether or not they're credible.
Very good. Interesting. Very,
Yeah.
very interesting. Well, you did a fantastic job, and everybody did a great
Thank you.
job asking questions. I love this new
Yes, thank you
format
so
because
much.
you're welcome. I love this new format because you're able to see everything. All right. Just a reminder
Great.
to everybody, we have 7 more webinars for the summer school series. So please make sure you go to the Macro Pro website to see what they are and to sign up for them. I can say though, next week we do have another great full accompaniment of different type of topics, including Medicare set-asides and the new world of compliance, surveillance, fraud, and discovery. We have apportionment and how an applicant might get a 100% rating. That's always interesting to see. How to identify high exposure claims early on so that we can take care of that, and so on and so on. So you can see there's lots of great classes. We certainly hope that you will join us. Again, this is Diane Cohen with MacroPro. If you ever need records, be sure to give us a call. And Annabella, we really appreciate your presentation today. Bye-bye,
Thank you
everyone.
for having me. I appreciate it. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.